Hello, and welcome to the ATPE podcast, brought to you by the Association of Texas Professional Educators and covering the hottest topics on Texas educators' minds today.
Hello, and welcome to the ATPE podcast. My name is Kate Johans, and it's my honor to serve as your Marketing and Engagement Director. I am here today with a very exciting guest, David Poor, who is ATPE's federal lobbyist. He is a partner at Hance Scarborough LLP in their Washington, D.C. office. He has also been worked as an associate in Hance Scarborough's Austin office. And before that, he was, back in the day when I first started at ATPE, one of our staff lobbyists. So his relationship with ATPE goes way back, but not as far back as actually the association's advocacy on the issue we're going to talk about today. So David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Glad to be here.
We are delighted to have you here to talk about this particular issue. And I must say, I'm excited and a little bit still in a state of shock that we are actually talking today about repeal of the WEP and GPO as something that has happened and not just something that we are continuing to work for. Could you please explain to our listeners why this is such a major milestone in the association's advocacy efforts?
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. So as you referenced, long ago, I was an in-house lobbyist for ATPE after working on Capitol Hill as a legislative director for a member of Congress from Texas. This issue of the Social Security Fairness Act and ATPE's involvement predates my time on Capitol Hill, which was back in the late 90s, predates my time, obviously, as an ATPE lobbyist beginning in 2002, and really goes back to 1983 to some changes that were made to the Social Security formulas at that time, dealing with folks that are eligible for a government pension and either a Social Security benefit based on their own payment into the system in covered positions, as they're known, and then also those that are eligible for spousal or widow benefits that are based on the work and payment into the system by their spouses. So it goes way back to 1983. It's something that as a young congressional staffer in the late 90s and early 2000s, working for a member of Congress from Texas, where so many of our public educators, retired public educators, are impacted by both the government pension offset and the WEP, really because of the choice of so many Texas school districts. I think in round numbers, it's about 1,000 out of the 1,100 or so school districts that opted out of the Social Security system and really chose for their educators and other employees to pay into the TRS system, but not into Social Security. So that meant that public educators and retired public educators and other public servants in Texas were disproportionately impacted by these offsets that became law in 1983.
Yeah, I remember one time I was looking through the archives of ATPE News and I found an issue from, 1984, 1985, and there was an article about the WEP and I read it and I thought, wow, I wrote that article last week and was honestly, I felt kind of demoralized at that point in time because, this was in the probably mid 2010s that I found it and I was like, oh, but we're in a very different place now. So can you tell me a little bit? I mean, how did you feel the night that it was repealed in the Senate? I mean, it was right before the holidays, came down to the wire.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the very last bill passed, including even after the continuing resolution to keep the government open. There was a lot of drama, a lot of suspense as to whether or not it was going to get done. There were some folks working very hard to run the clock out or to file poison pill amendments that they hoped would bring down the bill. So yeah, I shared your shock, elation, exhaustion, surprise, just all of those emotions kind of hit me at once. I mean, as I referenced, this is something that I started answering constituent mail as a congressional staffer in 1999, working for a member of Congress who supported Social Security reform and WEP and GPO repeal, Congressman Jim Turner from the old Texas 2nd Congressional District, who I served as legislative director for. And then as a lobbyist for ATPE, coming to Washington year after year to lobby for reform, for WEP and GPO reform, and in fact worked very early in that process, 2003, 2004 timeframe to get a discharge petition filed to get the Social Security Fairness Act released from the Ways and Means Committee to try to get a floor vote. And you fast forward 21, 22 years, and that's the exact mechanism by which this bill eventually made it to the House floor. One of the challenges, Kate, that the bill has always faced is the reality of the price tag on the Social Security Trust Fund.
Right.
We look back at why, a lot of people say, why did they do this? Well, the policy reason behind these offsets was to try to correct some inequities in the formula at the time that technically gave a little bit of an advantage in the calculation of benefits to those that were also eligible for a government pension. And so, unfortunately, the attempted correction in that inequity really created new inequities and really kind of swung things the other way to where public servants, public educators, firefighters, police officers, some federal employees were now had a formula applied to their benefit that was arbitrary and that in a lot of cases meant a substantial reduction either in their own Social Security benefit and very often the elimination of their eligibility for a spousal or widow benefit. So it's a very complicated formula, the Social Security system, and the WEP and GPO were equally complicated. There were good intentions behind the creation of those offsets to try to equalize the treatment of public sector employees and private sector employees in the Social Security formula, but they ended up really it was so complicated and created so many inequities and reduced the benefits that it really created a grassroots movement that frankly took a couple of decades to really catch on and overcome the opposition that many in Congress had to eliminating the GPO and the WEP, based mainly on the impact to the trust fund, concerns about maintaining the solvency of the trust fund into the future, and really the idea that if you completely eliminate the GPO and the WEP without replacing them with a different formula, a proportional formula or some other modification to the underlying Social Security formula to deal with this idea of how to treat beneficiaries who are eligible for government pensions. So there was a lot of worry, and the fiscal hawks and the Ways and Means Committee for many years kept this legislation from moving to the floor out of fear of what it would do to the trust fund. And there was always discussion of, well, we're going to deal with that in the context of full Social Security reform, where we extend the solvency of the trust fund out for decades. And what they're really talking about there is when the Congress comes together and has the will to raise the retirement age, to raise the amount of income subject to the Social Security tax, to shore up the solvency of the trust fund. For many years, for decades, the Congress, since 1983, Congress hasn't had the will to come together and do that. There's a reason why they refer to it as the third rail of American politics,
Right.
because nobody wanted to touch it for years and years. And so ATPE's role and my role as your federal consultant has been for the last 15 to 20 years, understanding that reality, to advocate for full repeal of the GPO and WEP, while at the same time making sure that we had a seat at the table as compromise proposals were considered by the Congress. So, very often we were trying to work to get partial reform until we could get to full repeal of the WEP and GPO in the context of that broader Social Security reform. And so ATPE in the spirit of ATPE, just like we advocate in Austin at the state capitol, we chose to be in the room as those discussions were taking place. While a lot of the national unions took a hard line, full repeal or nothing approach, ATPE, working with with TRTA and some of the other state retiree associations, kept an open mind and were open to partial repeal and replace legislation, particularly on the WEP side, while still supporting and advocating the full repeal bills, knowing those were going to be very challenging in the political environment that we've been in. Very tight budget constraints, very tight partisan margins in the Congress, just made it very, very difficult.
I imagine though, I was gonna say,
Yeah,
I imagine that having that seat at the table, being in the room when some of the partial solutions, that probably helped change some hearts and minds and bring some people on board with the idea of repeal that led to the full repeal. Because I mean, we're able to get to a point where a lot of circumstances aligned that made it possible for full repeal to actually pass. And I'm wondering if you could explain what was different this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was really a confluence of events, but you're absolutely right. Being at the table and being able to talk to a broader range of members of Congress, not just progressive Democrats aligned with the national teacher unions that were following their lead and were taking the full repeal or nothing, and not only conservative Republicans that were listening to the budget hawks and the trust fund hawks and the leadership within the Ways and Means Committee telling them, we can't afford to do this, it'll break the trust fund. We were able to talk to a broad coalition of members on both sides and use that as an opportunity to educate them about the issue. What does full repeal look like? What does that mean? How does this really impact retired educators back home? And use our grassroots, use communication from our local chapters and our members at the local level and the regional level, our DC trips where the ATPE leadership would come in and meet with the Texas delegation, and really being from Texas and representing the largest educator association in Texas. ATPE was in a unique position here, and being an independent association, and the fact that, as I referenced earlier, that Texas is one of the states most impacted by these two offsets, the government pension offset and the windfall elimination provision, because we're a large state and because we have so many, particularly on the education side, so many school districts opt out and have their educators only pay into the TRS system, not Social Security. But unfortunately, as you know, Kate, in Texas, we also have the disadvantage of not paying our public educators what
Right.
they deserve, and not funding the teacher retirement system and retired teacher health insurance, such that whatever Social Security benefit that retired educators in Texas are eligible for, whether it's through their own work or through their spouse's service in a covered position, unfortunately becomes extremely critical, and often is the
Right.
difference between being able to pay a utility bill or a grocery bill or whatever for a lot of our retired educators. So we came with a lot of credibility through numbers, through the impact on Texas public servants, especially retired public educators, and ATPE's willingness to talk to both sides and to be open to compromise proposals. So that kept us in very close contact. with the key decision makers on this, especially on the Ways and Means Committee. For years, we worked with Kevin Brady, who was from the Woodlands in Texas, a Republican who chaired the Ways and Means Committee and was in a strong position at one point to push a compromise bill that again fell apart through opposition of some of the national unions. But I think what was a little bit different this year, we had a couple of members in the House that joined as the lead sponsors. Abigail Spanberger from Virginia as the lead Democrat on the Social Security Fairness Act, and Garrett Graves from Louisiana. Louisiana is another state pretty heavily impacted proportionately by the offsets that took a bipartisan approach, and both of them coincidentally, for different reasons, announced their retirement from the Congress very early in the year, and really, I think, took it upon themselves to push for passage of this bill as part of their legacies as members of Congress.
Interesting.
So that was one
That is
thing we had
interesting.
going for us. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was great. And then you had, as often happens, you had, a large majority of the Congress sign on as a co-sponsor to this bill in each chamber. And then again, as we've seen in many other Congresses, you had the leadership of the Ways and Means Committee and to some extent the leadership of the House and Senate step in and say, not so fast. We better put the brakes on this bill. It's getting too much momentum. We can't let it out of committee. And that really kick-started additional conversations about what a compromise might look like, what something less than full repeal might look like. That was not acceptable to some of the interested stakeholder communities. And so then this discharge petition was filed. That is a means by where if you can get a majority of the House to sign a petition to release a bill from the Committee of Jurisdiction, you can discharge that bill from, in this case, the Ways and Means Committee, and demand a floor vote on the bill. Well, this is kind of like the dog catching the car, because you've got a bill with 300 plus co-sponsors every year. And now it's got a discharge petition, which they had always been able to keep the requisite number of signatures, 218, a majority of the House. They had always been able to prevent that 218 signature. This one got momentum and was really worked hard by those members, worked hard by stakeholder groups like ATPE and TRTA and the mass retirees, but was still at that point, and this is going back to October, November timeframe, still a lot of skepticism on my part, having worked on this for 25 years, having seen this movie several times before, having known that we had discharge petitions in the past. Jim Turner filed one. Lloyd Doggett from Austin filed one several years ago. But they had always died out right before they reached the 218. This one blew right past the 218. And then the leadership started scrambling and thinking of how they were going to slow it down. And discussions again began about something less than full repeal, some compromise, some replace on the WEP side. But once it passed the House, I think the thinking at that point was that the clock would run out and that the Senate would not find the floor time to take up the bill. So I think that the thinking of the Ways and Means Committee leadership and the House Republican leadership was, we can't stop this thing this year. We're going to have to let our members vote for it on the House floor. It ended up passing 327 to 75, so a large majority, well beyond the 2/3. They ended up bringing it up on the suspension calendar, which doesn't allow amendments but requires a 2/3 vote. Cleared that hurdle.
Wow.
But
That's
now we're
wonderful.
here really kind of counting the days on the legislative calendar in the Senate. And even after it passed the House with that large majority, people were asking me, what are the chances? And really up until mid-December, I was very negative about it, very skeptical, less than 50%.
I mean, I feel like you had 25 years of reason to be
I had a
little
pretty
skeptical.
good track record to base that gut feeling on. But then, what we saw was the grassroots all over the country, the unions, the non-union groups, the sheriff's associations, the firefighters, everybody started rowing in the same direction of demanding a Senate vote. And then in mid-December, the Chuck Schumer, the majority leader at the time, the Democratic leader from New York, had a rally with several of the stakeholder groups on the steps of the Capitol, and he publicly promised the Senate vote. And that was really a game changer. At that point, we believed him and knew that we'd get a vote, believed we would get a vote, didn't know what the rule in the Senate would look like, whether it would allow amendments that, if passed, would effectively water down the repeal or require that the offsets be paid for by future Social Security reforms, by raising the age or raising the amount of income subject to Social Security. We really wanted a clean vote on the bill without amendments. And it really came down to the last minute. There were some efforts by some of the budget hawks in the Senate to offer those types of amendments to require the bill to be paid for. Senator Cruz offered an amendment that would have replaced the repeal of both offsets with a WEP reform provision, very similar to the Brady approach and similar to an amendment that Congressman Arrington from Lubbock had offered. So still some real debate within the Senate about whether or not full repeal was something that was going to jeopardize the solvency of the trust fund, and whether or not the Senate ought to amend and water down the House's approach of full repeal. The problem was, at that point, we're at the very end of the road on the 118th Congress. This was on, the Friday night, very late into the night and into the early morning of Saturday morning, after they passed the continuing resolution to keep the government open. So we're talking 2 in the morning, between 1 and 2, when this bill was debated and passed.
Friday, right before Christmas, they all want to go home.
Everybody wanted to go home. We were very worried that they would adjourn without finishing this, or that one of those amendments would pass and there wouldn't be time for the bill to go back to the House to consider the Senate amendment. So it was really high stakes and dramatic, as I talked about. And I have to say, this had somewhat of a populist flair to it. This whole kind of movement to get this thing going. Very often, as I've referenced, fiscal conservatives and those worried about the long-term solvency of the trust fund, and those that want to be fiscally prudent with our taxpayer money and make sure that the formulas within the trust fund are equitable and we're not swinging things to the advantage of public retirees over private retirees. All of those concerns seem to somewhat go out the window here at the end of the 118th Congress. We had a lot of retiring members, including the 2 House sponsors, Ms. Spanberger and Mr. Graves, that were passionate about getting this bill moving. Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio had lost his reelection bid. He was a lead Democrat in the Senate pushing this. Senator Cassidy, a senior senator from Louisiana and a senior member of the Help Committee, was pushing and a co-sponsor of the bill. And then, in a strange, ironic twist of fate, a group of sheriffs went to Mar-a-Lago and mentioned to President-elect Trump their advocacy on this issue. And I don't know exactly how that conversation went down. In my mind, he probably made a flippant remark about being with them and for them on that, and they ran with it and began tweeting about President Trump's support. And next thing you know, there were some folks in the Senate checking on those reports with the Trump transition people, and were verified that, yeah, he did say that, and yeah, he does think that y'all ought to pass it. And pretty soon we started to see some Republican senators that previously had expressed opposition or reservations about full repeal, or had supported some of the compromise bills, but were worried about the impact on the trust fund of full repeal, flipped, changed their minds, and voted yes. One of them being our senior senator from Texas, John Cornyn, who had, just as recently as a couple of weeks before the Senate vote, been sending out a standard letter to constituents. A lot of them are ATPE members, writing in, telling them that he supported the compromise measure, but not full repeal.
I certainly saw some of those come through. Our members would forward them to me, and I was like, "Well, that's a very nice way to say no."
That's
But
exactly
yeah,
right. Well, he changed his mind and he ended up voting yes. Our junior senator, Ted Cruz, was a no vote, and actually led the effort on the amendment on the WEP compromise. But he did so, I believe, with good intentions and with intellectual honesty, in that he was an honest broker with ATPE and with me, he and his staff, about his effort. And we had an open line of communication, and he knew exactly how we felt about it. And we urged him very strongly to drop his amendment and to support full repeal, out of a sense of fiscal responsibility to the trust fund. He declined our request and pushed forward, but at that point, the writing was on the wall, and we knew it was going to pass. It ended up passing 76-20 in the Senate, with Cruz a no and Cornyn a yes. But with a whole lot of Republicans voting yes, that were taking that position for the first time, to my knowledge. So we were
I mean,
excited about that. We'll take it however we can get
I was
it.
gonna say, I thank goodness the sheriffs went to Mar-a-Lago, which I must admit is a place I'm sort of fascinated with, but that's not really the topic of this podcast.
Yeah, it's a strange world to me, but we're learning how to navigate, and we'll take this win. I think it's going to be, the impact on Texas educators, I think is going to be big in a lot of different ways. I mentioned earlier that, we're disproportionately impacted in Texas because we've got so many public educators and so many that spent most or all of their careers in non-covered positions that
Right,
pay only into TRS. Of the 2.1 million folks, beneficiaries subject to the Windfall Elimination Provision, around 10%, around 215,000 of those are Texas retired beneficiaries. And then on the GPO side, nationally, there's about 745,000 folks that have had their spousal or widow benefits reduced because of the GPO. And of those, over 100,000 were Texas retirees. So large impact. There are going to be, around 300,000 currently retired educators subject to these two offsets, and then many, many more that would have been, as they go to retire here over the coming years and decades, that'll benefit from this legislation. It's hard to know on a micro level, on an individual level, what I've been asked several times, what does this mean to the average
right,
teacher? Because the formulas are so individualized and depend on your individual circumstances and how much of your career you paid into a covered position in Social Security and how much of your career was spent in non-covered government pension, TRS in our case position. The impact or how much you can expect your benefit to increase, really depends on your individual circumstances. For those folks that have been wept, as we call it, had their
right,
own benefits reduced because they're eligible for the pension, it's really going to depend on how long you paid in to
right.
Social Security. So this sliding scale between 10 years and 30 years. So it depends on where you are there. But really, anywhere from 100 a month to 600 a month, depending on your circumstances. On the GPO side, if you would have been eligible for a spousal benefit, generally one half of your spouse's Social Security benefit, or the full benefit if you're a widow, that has been offset by 2/3 of your government pension. the increase in the new spousal or widow benefit that you get, will depend on what your Social Security benefit is, and what your spouse was eligible for. But you could really see some increased benefit checks to those beneficiaries who, those 103,000 in Texas and 745 across the country that have, if you think about it, TRS, in most circumstances, 2/3 of a TRS benefit is going to be more than one half of your spouse's Social Security
Right.
benefit. So it's going to completely eliminate your eligibility. And so there are many Texas retired educators that will want to go back and apply for a spousal benefit, and should receive half of their spouse's benefit or the whole Social Security benefit if their spouse has passed away. So that's where I think you're going to see some substantial increases in benefits, anywhere from 1,000 or more a month, depending on what your pension is, what your TRS pension is, and what your spouse's Social Security benefit is.
That's
So really, really
just
exciting. And
wonderful.
a lot of people think, Kate, that maybe it was a clerical error, a technical error, but the effective date on this bill is back to January 1, 2024. So
I
this is for
I noticed
benefits
that. Yes.
paid out, beginning in 2024. And so, a lot of folks that were closely watching expected a technical amendment in the Senate to make the effective date January 1, 2025. That didn't get done. So what that means is the bill is retroactive back to January. And so Social Security is going to have to cut checks, lump sum checks to many of these folks, both on the WEP side and the GPO side. So that's
That's
really exciting.
that is very exciting. So when I know obviously President Biden signed the bill on January 5th. Obviously now the Social Security Administration has to go through the figuring out how to implement this to get all these lump sum checks and all the increased payments going forward. What kind of timeline do we expect for that? Because I'm sure our listeners are anxiously awaiting that answer.
Yes, and the Social Security Administration is a bureaucracy, and a very big one, and a
Right.
very slow one. And so that is kind of the question on everybody's mind. If you check their website or you check in with Social Security, it's basically we're working on it,
Right.
details TBD, that kind of thing. I did get my hands on a letter that the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the chairman of the subcommittee on Social Security wrote to the administration just Friday, as a matter of fact, asking some of these same questions. So we're not completely out on an island here in the dark if the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is asking these same questions. For example, what is SSA's plan to implement the Social Security Fairness Act? What action will affected beneficiaries have to take to ensure that their benefits are properly adjusted and additional benefits are paid appropriately? How and when will the SSA provide notice to these beneficiaries? So these basic fundamental questions about how are you going to implement this? What is the timing? When do the lump sum checks come? When do the new increased checks kick in? These are all questions that the administration is struggling with. Some of this will need to be decisions made by the new folks coming in with the Trump administration. There will be, several career holdovers that are working on it now. But the chairman of the committee and the subcommittee asked for a fairly quick turnaround and have requested prompt responses to these questions no later than January 17th. So Friday.
Friday. Okay. Well, we will
Friday, yeah.
be on
So
the lookout
I'm not
for.
exactly, I'm not holding my breath. A lot of times they will reach out and the answer will be, we're working on it. We'll get you more as soon as we can. I anticipate that will probably be the response here. But the same folks on that Ways and Means Committee that we've been working with for many, many years on WEP and GPO reform will be working on the implementation at the agency. So we have an open line of communication and a good pipeline to get that intel as soon as it comes in. And we'll be sharing that with ATPE members. giving them links to the web page, making sure, I did see on the Social Security Administration's website where they basically said we're working on it. More details TBD. It did say make sure that on your if you've got an account on the Social Security webpage, make sure your address is current and your
Hmm.
direct deposit information is current. That's going to be important. To me, that indicates that those retroactive lump sum checks for folks that do have accounts with direct deposit will go in that way. So they're working on it, and we're going to be nudging them along with our friends on Capitol Hill to make sure that they implement it correctly and in a timely manner, and that they're putting out as much information as possible so that folks know if they need to go back and reapply for the spousal benefit because they were told they weren't eligible because their pension offset it. Do they need to refile? That's a big question in my mind, or will that be automatic? Things like that are all going to be information that we should be getting in the next few weeks.
Excellent. And we will definitely be sharing that on Teach the Vote as soon as David and his team get their hands on it. Well, you touched on some of the concerns that the people who voted against the full repeal had about Social Security, and certainly we all have heard that there is the danger of the trust fund, being projected to be unable to pay out benefits, and I guess 2033 was the year I was seeing. Well, like, obviously, you also alluded to the fact that no one really wants to be the person, maybe Rand Paul does, but that raises the retirement age. That's a tough thing to tackle. What what do you think, and what's on the horizon for the fund now? And what will we as ATPE be watching for and advocating for?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is Congress is going to have to pull together the will and the strength and the bipartisan compromise to come together on a full Social Security reform bill, or else we're going to hit insolvency at the end of 2033. That's going to result in an immediate 20 to 25% reduction in benefits without action by Congress. Um, the bill that passed, the Fairness Act, had a price tag of about $196 billion over a 10-year window and was estimated um, to, uh, uh, to move the insolvency date up by 6 months. So caused the trust fund to hit that insolvent point 6 months quicker than it would have without the bill passing. In the grand scheme of things, after 40 years of these offsets, 25 years of working on it myself, 6 months, 196 billion sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. And we need to address the solvency of the trust fund. But I believe, part of our messaging on this, and one of the reasons it finally got done, was that enough members of Congress and enough stakeholders and enough advocates for educators and sheriffs and public servants were able to convince enough people uh, that public servants, firefighters, teachers, cops, maybe they deserve a little bit better Social Security formula for the long hours they put in, for their dedication to public service, for the money they're paying in teachers' cases out of their own pockets, for school supplies,
Right.
for the unpaid overtime, for all of those reasons that we that advocate for teachers and other public servants. We finally became increasingly comfortable making that argument to the policymakers, and they finally started to nod along.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of that had to do with wearing them down over years of advocacy, grassroots, them hearing about this issue through constituent letters, hearing about it back home in the Walmart in the district, um, all of those factors coming together. So uh, now I think we got to turn to, and it's going to be a much broader coalition that encourages the Congress to have that will to come together to protect this social safety net that our elder Americans count so much on. And it does concern me when you start to see proposals being kicked around for large corporate and high tax bracket cuts to be extended, and talk about how to pay for that. That is now haven't heard, because the trust fund is kind of handled separately than the rest of the budget. I haven't heard that on the chopping block just yet, but the Medicare and Medicaid programs. So these are all moving parts that we're going to have to decide as a society and the Congress that represents us, what our priorities are, and just have the strength to tackle that. I think it's going to have to be a bipartisan, probably a divided Congress, and like anything else, they're going to wait until the 11th hour and probably pass this in that last Congress before the trust fund goes insolvent. But we're going to be advocating for the government to put up the resources to minimize the impact on retired Americans.
Well, and I think your point about retired public servants in particular, and teachers, and some of these first responders that have sacrificed so much over the years in terms of their own financial resources, putting themselves in danger. I mean, certainly our classroom educators, campus educators are putting themselves in danger many times now, and that has become, certainly our legal team is dealing with a lot of educators that are experiencing student assault and things like that. So I think that it is great to hear that people were nodding along when you were making that argument, because that's really very heartening to hear that people are seeing the same things that we at ATPE have always seen.
So when they finally do come together and pass legislation to reform Social Security, extend the solvency, we and other stakeholders that got this done are going to have to protect those gains.
Absolutely.
And make sure that WEP and GPO are not, whenever at that point, seen as part of the pay for extending the solvency of the trust fund. We're going to have to advocate for creative ways to shore that trust fund up without requiring people to work into their, way into their 70s to get a benefit. And so we're going to be involved in that conversation. This one is personal to me because I'm the son of a career public educator. My mother, Sheila Ray, taught in the Austin Independent School District for many, many years and other school districts around Texas. And she has had her Social Security benefit reduced through the WEP since she retired. So she's going to get a raise in her Social Security benefit. But just through my work with ATPE and all the incredible public educators I've had the opportunity to work with and advocate on this issue and other issues, it's a real labor of love and a huge win.
It really is. But I think, like you said, we can declare victory, but we can't go home. We got to stay vigilant on this. So
we got to make sure they implement it right. We got to make sure our members know how to take advantage of the increase in their benefit, refile if they have to. And then we got to keep scaling this back off the table when they get to full reform.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, David. I know our listeners are going to really appreciate your insights on this. So as always, it is a pleasure. And we hope to see you at the summit this summer in Austin.
I can't wait to come give that update. It's going to be a completely different update. But I want to also give credit to and thank all of the ATPE leaders over the years who have taken the time to write those letters and send those emails to their members of Congress, for the ATPE leadership that has come to Washington, D.C. to walk the halls of the Capitol office buildings with me to advocate on this. That's what made the difference.
Yeah, it's a really great story, and I hope we continue to tell it. I plan to continue to tell it in many places. So thank you so much, and thank you to all of our listeners, and we will look forward to you joining us on our next episode of the ATPE podcast.
Thanks for listening to the ATPE podcast. For more information about becoming part of Texas's largest community of educators, please visit atpe.org.